So last week we began to talk about the Bible, and we talked about why we can trust the Bible, and we talked about the basic theme of the Bible, which is God reconciling mankind to himself. And that is the theme that we'll see from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Old Testament. And I just wanted to ask all of us to just take every preconceived idea that we have about the Bible and just get rid of it right now. So a lot of us have tended to think that the Bible is kind of boring or really difficult to read, hard to understand. And yes, there are some things that are hard to understand, and it takes a lot of effort sometimes. And there are some things that are easy to understand, but understanding how the Bible is written and divided up is one thing that really helps in the process of getting a better understanding of what we're reading. So there's 39 books in the Old Testament, and the first 17 books are books that are historical narrative. They move the story of the Old Testament forward, and now actually 11 of those books move the story forward, and then there's 6 out of those first 17 that actually kind of pause and fill in more detail within the story. And then after those 17 books, we have the books of wisdom, which are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then after those books, the last 17 books are the prophets. And as we begin to understand the first 17 books and the story, then we can take the prophets and figure out where they fit in the timeline, and then their books begin to make more sense as well. So we're just going to begin this week. Hopefully we're only going to spend 2 weeks on the Old Testament. We're going to begin with the story of the Old Testament and see how it falls in with the theme of the Bible and what it all means for us. So within these 17 books, first 17 books is there's 4 eras to the story, and there's this era of beginnings, the era of settlements, the era of the kingdom, and the era of exile. So we'll just begin talking about the era of beginnings, and that of course would be Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. Those are the chronological books that move the story forward. So obviously beginnings, Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth, and then of course shortly after that we see the fall of man and the mess that we're all in because of the choices that Adam and Eve initially made and throwing our entire existence into a sinful state. And we have the Tower of Babel, which is another new beginning. That's in chapter 11, where man became really proud and thought that they could do things without God. And God basically said, okay, I'm going to confuse their language. And that's why we have different languages today. Then there's the flood, where the Bible says that humanity, all their thoughts were only evil all the time, and there was really no hope for them ever to turn back to God. So God destroyed everyone on earth except for Noah and those that were with him. And there was a new beginning there. When Noah and his family got off the ark, repopulation happened. And then from there we go to Abraham. And Abraham makes a promise, or God makes a promise to Abraham and says, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And that's talking about the nation of Israel, and also talking about all those who would follow Jesus, because Jesus was descended from Abraham, and all those who follow Jesus are also considered to be children of Abraham. So Abraham has 12 children, and they have more children. That becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel goes into slavery for 400 years, and God is silent during that time. And then 400 years later, God raises up Moses to deliver Israel out of slavery from the Egyptians. And Moses gave Israel the law, which is another thing that God used to try to bring his people back, to reconcile his people. Then they came to the point where God said, okay, I brought you out of slavery, I want to take you into the promised land. But all the people grumbled and said, no, we can't go in there because the people are too big. And there's only 2 people that believed. That was Joshua and Caleb. And they believed God. So as a result of Israel's disbelief, they had to wander in the desert for 40 years. And after the 40 years was up, Joshua and Caleb were still living, and they got to move into the promised land. Joshua led them because Moses died. And that moves us into the era of settlement, and we'll talk about the settlement era, and then we'll stop for today and move on to the other eras next week. So Joshua leads Israel into the promised land. And then there's a time of judges. Samson, I'm not sure. Samson, if you're familiar with that story, that's in the book of Judges. Samson was one of the judges. So during this time, it was kind of like a roller coaster. The Israelites would obey God and they would turn away. They would obey him and turn away. And whenever they would turn away, God would judge them, and there would be maybe an attack from another country or something like that. And then they would cry out to God, and he would come and rescue them. And the way that he would do that is he would raise up a judge who would lead Israel, and then they would be back right with God again. And that just went on for a time. And Samuel was the last judge of Israel. And Samuel anointed the first king of Israel, which was King Saul. And that's where we'll pick up the story next week. Hopefully this is helpful if we can just begin to understand how the Old Testament is divided up, and then we'll move on to the New Testament and begin to understand that if we really put some effort, it's not that hard to understand what's going on in the Bible. And the Bible is what God has given us to connect with him. So it's really important that we begin to understand how we can use it and how we can read it and understand it and really begin to know God through reading Scripture. So that's it for this week. I'll talk to you again next week.